So today I'm going to tell you a little bit about our program of research where we've worked with teachers and school administrators to try to make evidence-based practices a little more useful for classroom use for kids who have autism spectrum disorder. So my plan for today is to talk a little bit about implementation science and what that means and why we're doing it, very briefly. A little bit about the intervention we adapted, which is pivotal response training, and then a little bit about the adapted intervention, and more hopefully about the process that we use to adapt the intervention, because to me that's the most exciting part. We have lots of evidence-based practices for autism that we're finding to be useful and successful. So I'm going to tell you about the intervention today because I know that it's nice to have some practical information, but really this process can be used for a lot of different interventions, and I'm not trying to sell you on this intervention, I guess. I always like to make sure. So let's start with implementation science and why we want to worry about how interventions that are developed that we know work for kids with autism or anything really are used in the community. And one of the reasons is traditionally in research, we've come up with what we think may be amiss and then a strategy that may work for that as we translate it into a clinical practice. Then we test it in a really, really controlled study to see if it works with kids who have autism and no other issues that are able to come to a particular center and do it. And then the idea was then once we knew something worked, people could use it in the community and all kids could benefit from it. And that was sort of this model of pushing out from the university or the scientific labs into the community. But that hasn't worked out so well. It hasn't worked out so well in children's mental health as one example. They've done a lot of studies of evidence-based interventions that work really well in labs, that when you look at all the studies where they're used in communities, there's not as much difference. There's sort of what they're calling a voltage drop, where the outcomes are not as strong in community settings. And so what we need to try to do is figure out why that is. And one of the things is to try to look at information of what's happening in the community and bring it back into the research setting and make this more of a bi-directional process so that researchers aren't developing a bunch of things that can't really be used in the community. So that's what I want to talk a little bit about today and why we have this kind of relatively new science so that we can get things to the community faster in ways that work, so we don't have to take a long time to get them to you and then take a long time modifying them. Although the process I'll talk about today will seem like a long time. So do we have this same challenge in autism as we've seen in other fields? And researchers in autism will say, well, we have this voltage gap because we have providers who aren't really using the intervention the way we said. They're not using all the pieces, or they're not using it as intensively, and that's why we're not seeing the great outcomes that we see in our clinic. And then we have providers, teachers saying, that's very fine and good, researchers. We are adapting it. We aren't using it the same way. But we have to take all comers. We can't separate our kids into the ones that fit your research parameters. And we've got, not one child coming into our office, but we've got a whole classroom full of kids with lots of different needs. And so we have to adapt things. And we think they are working better based on our clinical expertise. So there's that tension there, right? And then in autism, we have a special gift of having kids served across lots of different settings and very different kinds of kids, a very heterogeneous population. So when we look at children's mental health, for example, we're looking at sort of an hour of therapy a week in a lot of times. When we look at autism, we're looking at a full school day plus speech therapy, occupational therapy. There may be mental health services and after-school services, and how do we incorporate all those different interventions we need into those settings? So it's not learning one particular intervention, but learning lots of different interventions implemented by lots of different providers. I mean, other people in other disorders may not think we're more complicated, but I think we are. We're complicated. So what implementation science has tried to do is think about how we can use this collaboration to really try to make this work. So researchers and community members aren't kind of battling it out, but thinking about how we can work together so people are able to implement the interventions in a way that's effective. So what we've been doing across a variety of interventions is looking at what are the evidence-based sort of critical elements of care. You heard Dr. Hansen say we're really looking at what are those pieces that are the most important for people to use. Do we need to use the whole package? Looking at what providers are saying, this is really important, this is how we're individualizing practice. We don't really know how to do that in research. We're really dependent on clinical expertise for that, and so can learn a lot from providers on that. And talking with families about what's important to them, what do they feel is making the most difference for their kids. And trying to start with that overlap, what people are able to use, what values match, and then trying to then take those areas of agreement and build on them to maximize the acceptability of the intervention, the feasibility of it, as well as the effectiveness. So we have effective interventions. They're super duper complicated and hard to implement in the community. We could make feasible interventions that were really easy, but they may not be effective. So we need to kind of meet somewhere in the middle to make sure we're getting those critical elements so we have the interventions that work, but are also feasible. Does that make sense? So it can't be just one or the other. So, questions about implementation science? Make sense? So I'm going to give you kind of one example of how we've tried to do this with one particular evidence-based practice called pivotal response training. And these are my co-investigators, Jessica Zerheinrich, Sarah Reith, Laura Schreibman, and our teacher partner, Cynthia Boldak, who has been wonderful working with us throughout this whole process, and our teacher advisory board, and this is supported by the Department of Education. Lots and lots of people have contributed to this. I'm very lucky that I get to be the one to talk to you about it today. But this is the project I'm going to share with you that then kind of highlights our process. So let's talk for just a second about pivotal response training. Who's heard of pivotal response training? A few people. Okay, great. So it's an evidence-based practice. The recent reviews from the National Center for Professional Development and the National Autism Project, several meta-analyses have listed pivotal response training as an evidence-based practice for young children with autism, primarily around social communication, social skills, play skills, a new study coming out with motor skills. So it is an evidence-based practice. Over 30 years, this has been in production? No, in use and studied, okay? It's a naturalistic behavioral intervention based on the principles of applied behavior analysis. And so, and we'll talk just a minute about that, but it's based in those same principles. So I'm gonna digress for 1 second about applied behavior analysis because since I'm standing here, I can use my soapbox. So one of the challenges we have in implementing evidence-based practices in our community is how we see and define different evidence-based practices. So when we talk about the evidence-based practices from those large reviews, people will say, well, 75% of those interventions are based on applied behavior analysis. This is true. But oftentimes in the community, those get equated with one particular type of applied behavior analysis that's highly structured called discrete trial teaching. Have people heard of discrete trial teaching? Yes, so I just want to talk a little bit about the difference between applied behavior analysis and discrete trial teaching. Applied behavior analysis is really more of a theory, a research strategy where we're looking at behavioral strategies that can be used to make meaningful social changes in people. We've used it in autism through discrete trial teaching. It was one of the very first to show evidence, and I think that's one of the reasons it's so equated with this particular theory. It's used in smoking cessation, dieting, military, all kinds of things that we use applied behavior analysis for. So the strategy I'm going to talk about today is naturalistic. It's not as structured as discrete trial teaching. It's still based on applied behavior analysis. There are lots of different methods. These are some of those from the reviews that are based on applied behavior analysis. They may be integrated with other strategies. This is not an exhaustive list. Some of them are specific strategies. Some of them are comprehensive. So I just kind of want to broaden our view of applied behavior analysis. And now I will jump off my soapbox and we'll talk again about pivotal response teaching. So the goal with these naturalistic developmental behavioral strategies like pivotal response training, which is similar to other models like Early Start Denver model, things like that, is that we're really looking at maintaining student motivation. Okay? So the goal when these programs were developed, and the developers of this actually worked with the developer of discrete trial teaching and had some concerns about how the kids were learning from that, and wanted to think about how we can help kids be more motivated to learn and give them more opportunities for directing their own learning. And that's really sort of the main move behind these naturalistic behavioral interventions, is the motivation. But pivotal response training was developed specifically as a parent-implemented model for one-on-one settings. Okay, it wasn't developed for classrooms. But when we, let me just tell you about the components briefly. So based on applied behavior analysis, which is antecedent, what happens before, child gives us a behavior, and then we apply a consequence. That's sort of the basics of applied behavior analysis. And in PRT, it's naturalistic, so it's done within whatever activity we set up for the child to do, and this is not rocket science, we gain the child's attention and give them a clear instruction, which is in a lot of different interventions. We mix in easy and difficult tasks, which is, again, different from some of the more structured, and that is to keep kids motivated to keep going. Like if I were doing a worksheet with all calculus problems, you have to put some addition in or I'm going to start to cry, that kind of thing. Shared control, which I'm going to give you an example of that in a little bit, and then ways to broaden kids' attention, which I'm also going to talk about in a little bit. So that's kind of how we set up the learning environment, with this really clear instruction that gives the children some choices in what they're going to do. They do something, they either do it right, they do it wrong, they do a good try, and then as the teacher or the adult, we respond with some kind of a reward that hopefully is directly related to the activity. And that's the difference with these naturalistic strategies as well, trying to make the activity and the reward really meaningful for the child. So if I ask for a car, I get the car I want to play with. Then it's going to be based on what I did. So if I if I hold up a car and say, what is this? And the child says a duck, not going to give them the car, we're going to try again. But I might reward it if they tried, what is this? And they said, ka, and I know they're really working on car, but they're not quite getting it. I might reward that, again, to keep that motivation high. So those are the components that we were looking at from the one-on-one intervention. And as part of another study, we interviewed a lot of teachers in Southern California, San Diego and Riverside, and asked them, what are you doing in the classroom? Now, PRT was developed in Southern California, so not surprisingly, lots of opportunities to learn it, and 70% of the 100 teachers we talked to said they were using PRT in their classrooms. But as we expected, they said they were using parts of it, they were adapting it, they weren't using it like the manual, the parent manual, which is all they had, said to use it. And so this seemed like a nice model for us to try to think about this adaptation, because we knew the intervention really well. Laura Schreibman's on our team, she's one of the developers. We had a lot of teachers saying this was interesting, and we had an opportunity to gather some more information about how they were making these adaptations and how that was affecting child outcomes, right? Because if the adaptations don't change the outcomes, great. But we want to be able to explain that and teach new people to do it rather than have them try to figure out the adaptations themselves. So that's kind of why we picked this particular intervention. Most of the teachers said this intervention made sense to them, they liked it, and so this is why we chose this intervention. So here is the process we took, and then we'll take each piece separately. So we started by gathering information from teachers. We did that by meeting with them and having focus groups, which I'll tell you about, and then by taking lots of video recordings of them using PRT in the classroom, which they just love. Testing possible changes based on the feedback that we got. So we didn't want to just change things. Again, they could tell us what makes it feasible. I'm leaving out that step. And we could say, okay, but more we wanted to see, what does it mean to leave out that step? How does that change the child outcomes? So that then we could develop a model and resources for them to use something that was adapted that we thought would work. We just recently finished publishing a pilot test of the adapted model that showed that teachers could learn it, and we saw nice changes in child behavior. And we had advisory board feedback at every single stage, especially in developing the resources. And right now we're just finishing up our randomized trial of the intervention with about 100 teachers, and I will give you some super preliminary data at the end of the day today, which is very exciting, for me anyway. So I'm going to take you through this process. So let's start with gathering information from the teachers. So we started with focus groups, where we asked teachers to come in and talk to us about PRT. We talked to teachers who were trained in PRT and were using it. We talked to teachers who are trained in PRT and decided, no, thank you, I don't want to use it, because we thought that was really important. And then there are a lot of teachers who use some similar strategies, but they're not calling it PRT. These are good teaching strategies, right? So we wanted to talk to them. So here's what they said. This is a summary of what they said. First, they talked about the benefits. We asked them, what are the benefits? What are the barriers? And they said, this feels like good teaching to us. This makes sense to us as teachers. We do a lot of this anyway. We see that kids' skills improve. That is really key for people using an evidence-based strategy. It's got to work with the kid in front of you, right? And we really see kids being able to use these skills, not just in our classrooms, but on the playground and at home. We see generalization of those skills to new places. But we also see some barriers, right? This is really hard to do in groups. Well, that makes sense, right? Because it wasn't developed to use in groups or classrooms. Really hard to integrate into the classroom. And some of the steps we just really don't think are appropriate for our kids, or they're really extra hard to implement in a group. Then they brought up a bunch of issues we didn't even think of around training. They said, we need some kind of manual that looks pretty, so when I go to the principal and say, I want to do this intervention, I have a thing. Can't just be like random Xerox handouts, right? It has to be a real thing. In order to understand PRT, I need some training in applied behavior analysis, which many education programs and special education programs don't have that as part of their education. So they feel like they really needed that background. And the teachers told us, we are in charge of training our paraprofessional staff, and we need some help and materials to help them understand this, because they're going to be the ones implementing this a lot of the time. Okay, so these are the things they told us. Now, I want you to keep in mind some of those steps or components they didn't like. So then we wanted to go and see, what are they really doing? Because sometimes what people say and what they do are different. In fact, we did find they were better at some of those steps they thought were hard than they thought. So we had some really nice opportunities to look at 2 different samples of teachers who are trained in PRT. So we had one group of teachers that Dr. Sir Heinrich, who's a partner on this project, had trained as part of her dissertation, okay? So they were research trained, they were only learning PRT, they had sort of the top-notch training you could get. And then we had a group of teachers who were in a larger trial of public schools where they were learning a really comprehensive intervention. PRT was one component. So they were learning PRT, but they were also learning discrete trial and a bunch of other methods from kind of a company that clinically trained people. So it might be a little more challenging for them, but they were using PRT also. So we had lots of video from both of these, and we took a look at that. So the percent correct implementation is over there, and these are each of the components that we talked about. Okay? And so if I were a researcher, I would say before you can start using PRT when you're working with kids in our research program, you have to meet 80% criteria. You have to be doing this right, using all the steps 80% of the time in order for me to say you're trained, okay? Whether we need to have that level or not, I don't know, but that's what we use. And so when we look at the teachers in the San Diego study that were researcher trained, they're doing pretty well on most of the steps, and they're kind of even beating that criteria in a lot of cases. We look at the clinically trained group. They're almost there, but not quite on a lot of the steps. It's harder. It's harder also because they were learning 3 different interventions, but they're actually doing pretty well. But you see the same pattern, right? So these 2 components, the turn taking and the multiple cues, which I'll explain in a minute, were not being used well, okay? And in the focus group, they also told us these were the hardest. So this one's really complicated, and you'll notice when I explain it in a minute, it's really complicated. And the turn taking, teachers aren't really used to that. They're used to teaching like I'm doing right now. I am not taking turns with you. And so that part was hard. So those 2 things were hard. So what we decided to do for those 2 components is take that back into the laboratory and do some studies on whether or not those 2 components were really necessary. Are they key ingredients? Do we need them in this model, or can we throw them out, or when do we need them? Okay. So let's start with this multiple cues component. It's confusing, so bear with me. So one of the things we've learned from studies beginning in the 60s with people with autism is sometimes some people will hyper-focus on a particular aspect of something in their environment. So kids, for example, who don't recognize their uncle if he takes his glasses off. they really are recognizing by the glasses. I have a friend, she can't recognize me when I don't wear the same shoes, so I have to introduce myself and say, here are my shoes for today, and then she can recognize me, right? And so that's a challenge when you're trying to learn new things in a classroom. So part of what PRT had was this component where we use what's called conditional discriminations to have kids really look at more than one piece of whatever it was they were focusing on. It's kind of a simple way to do it. It was just usually 2 pieces, but it's a component of PRT that teachers were finding hard. So an example would be, I want to orient a child to a couple different things. So I've got their drawing. They like to draw. It's motivating. I've got a set of crayons, and I've got a set of colored pencils. And if they want a particular color, they need to tell me the color they want and the kind of implement they want. So they can't just say, I want the blue one. They need to say, I want the blue crayon, or I want the red pencil. Does that make sense? So we're looking at those 2 pieces, okay? And so what teachers said about this isn't developmentally appropriate for all our kids, especially our preschoolers. We are not expecting them to do this. They can't do it. Oh, that's interesting. Hadn't thought of that. Very hard to implement in group lessons to kind of set up this dual thing and make sure they're getting it in, and pretty time consuming for the number of kids they had, okay? So first thing we did was go back to the literature and say, maybe someone studied this and we don't have to. That's our favorite. So we did see a lot of studies that this over-selectivity interferes with learning. A lot of them were older studies of individuals with autism who had been in institutions, had pretty severe intellectual disability. So we wanted to see when would it be developmentally appropriate, right? And so we looked for, in the typical literature too, what's a developmental progression? There is a developmental progression. You need to, as you get older, you get better at this, but there was nothing in the literature that told us when we could expect kids to do it, so we could help teachers with that. So we're like, all right, I guess we'll have to study that. So our first study was looking at what age typically developing children can respond to these conditional discriminations, because teachers are telling us it's not developmentally appropriate. So that's us bringing that clinical expertise back into the lab. And then we also wanted to ask if that's necessary for today's students with autism who are getting early intervention much more naturalistic and much sooner than the people in all of these studies who are having these challenges with this particular kind of discrimination, right? So these were the 2 things we brought back into the lab. Let me start with at what age typically developing children can do this, and I'm going to describe the study too. So Dr. Sarah Reith did this project as part of her dissertation, and what we did was look at a 2-part conditional discrimination. So we had these blocks, the orange pyramid and the green cube, and kids learn that one of these is correct. Give me the correct one. So for you, I'm going to teach you that the correct one is this green cube. Okay, so every time you pick the green cube, you're gonna get a candy or a cheer or whatever it is, okay? So once you've got that really consistently, then I'm gonna show you some different sets of blocks. And I'm gonna mix them up. Sometimes you get them, sometimes you don't, but I'm only gonna reward the initial. So when I show you these 2 pink blocks, if you've understood that you're looking at a cube, you're gonna pick the cube, right? Most of the time. And when I show you this set of colored blocks, and you've noticed that that cube you're picking every time is green, you're going to pick that green T, okay? And if you didn't really notice, you're going to do it at chance, 50-50, right? So this is the assessment we gave. So we took about 37 typically developing children from 19 months to 50 months from local preschools. They had all had a screener of their development, and none of them had any first-degree relatives with autism, to see at what age we could expect them to do this. So we looked at this. So what you're going to see is the different ages and their percent correct. And we're going to expect, this is their percent correct on the one they did the worst on, okay? So if they got it both parts, the one they did the worst on should be above 80%, right? If they didn't get it, it should be chance or less. So the little guys, they're just not good at this. 27 to 36 months old are pretty much at chance. So they're picking one aspect or the other. Once you're 36 months, and if you do some kind of fancy growth curve statistics that I don't understand, it basically says by 36 months, you can do this task. And I think all but one of our kids could do this that were over 36 months. And he got the orange pyramid and he really liked green. So we think he was more just wanting the green one than not getting it. So pretty consistently, kids are getting this at 36 months. And so what that's telling us is that the teachers who are working with preschool kids with autism, who may or may not have language skills and cognitive skills at 36 months, are super correct that this is not developmentally appropriate for all their kids. Thank you. Please don't use it with those kids. You know, so that makes a big difference in how you're implementing this and what it means to meet fidelity. So we answered that question. We also did some additional studies on attention with children with autism and on turn taking and when to do that, and I'm happy to talk with you about those afterward. I don't have time to go through each one, but I wanted to give you that example of how we did it. And we confirmed some of the teacher recommended changes. So most kids with autism aren't having so much trouble with that two-part conditional discrimination. Doesn't mean they don't have any attention challenges, but that particular task, probably not a necessary component to use in PRT. We talk more about using different examples and ways we ask for things so kids don't get stuck versus having to do this particular thing. With the turn taking, it was more complicated. So for some tasks, turn taking was really important, like learning to comment and learning object play. But for other tasks, like learning to ask for things, it wasn't. So we've made some recommendations and some simplifications based on that. And then for some of the components that they said were hard, the new materials hopefully simplify them a bit. And the idea was then to make this protocol easier. So that's sort of the process of adaptation that we took, as well as developing new resources. So, and our advisory board was incredible with this. So we changed the name a little bit so that it was clear that these were for classroom activities. And we adapted things based on all the feedback and the studies. We made professional materials. We used a lot of group examples that our advisory board was really great about coming up with, because when we did it, they were like, no. And so they helped us. We have materials for data collection, which is a challenge in these naturalistic strategies. Again, we had all of our advisory board bring us in what they were using, and we tried to put in lots of different types so that it turns out there's no one good way to collect data. So we just gave examples and a system for that. Paraprofessional training materials, so there's a DVD. And again, I'm not trying to sell you this book. I'm just trying to say how we adapted with the things that they needed, how to use CPRT with specific IEP goals, and sort of what activities and goals might be best for this, and what you might want to choose another intervention for, because certainly no intervention is going to work for all kids and all goals. So that's what we tried to do with the materials. So now I'm going to just talk about a little bit about the strategies, so you have some information, and then our data. So then we developed a training program, starting with the basics and moving up for the teachers. That first starts with information about applied behavior analysis, because they asked for that. We review the principles and components. Then we talk about getting them really comfortable at using those with individual students so they feel happy with their use of the components. Then we talk about using this in groups, because most of them are doing that most of the time. Integrating it in the classroom in the context of whatever their classroom is like, whatever other strategies they're using, when it might be helpful to integrate this, and then how to teach others. Okay. So I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about some of the ways we're teaching that. And so we talk a lot about using this ABC, applied behavior analysis strategy in groups, because it's a little more complicated. So this slide will sort of illustrate that, where, say we're working on a counting activity with 3 students, okay? So pretend that's Jonathan, Ralph, and Helen. They're our students. I'm sitting at a table as the teacher. They're counting. I'm using M&Ms because that's super motivating to help them count. Ralph and Helen right now are coloring on a worksheet, coloring M&Ms in of there are different numbers on the worksheet, and that's keeping them busy. So I'm working with Ralph. Some of them are learning to count kind of individually, and some of them can look at a group and say how many. So the teacher might do that. Count the M&Ms. He counts them. He gets the M&Ms. Now he counts them. This little girl's a little better. How many M&Ms? She says how many. She gets the M&Ms. So it's sort of like one student, you're doing this back and forth ABC while the others are busy. And that works kind of well for a lot of activities for teachers. Okay. So I'm just going to take you through how we teach teachers one particular component so you can see how we do that, and then we'll talk a little bit about the data. So I want to talk about the shared control piece because it's a little complicated and it's sort of one of the more motivating pieces. And it's one of the pieces that teachers have a challenge with, but once they figure it out, really like it. So what shared controls means is we want to follow students' lead by giving choices that we choose of activities and materials and by taking turns. So you can imagine, like, your doctor tells you you have to exercise. You're like, great. And if he says you have to go to the gym every morning at 6 a.m., you might say, no, thank you. But if he said, you know, you can choose, you can go to the gym, or there's this great hiking group and, you know, that leaves from your office at 5, you know, you might choose one or the other, right? It might be different at different times of year. So maybe in the summertime, this hiking group looks really great and that helps me get outside and exercise. But in the wintertime, when it's dark and the hiking group happens during the day when I'm at work, I might exercise more if I could go to the gym at 6 a.m., right? So the choices may change, but me getting that exercise in depends on me having some flexibility, right? Okay. So that's kind of the shared control. So one thing we can do is incorporate students' preferred materials. And it's nice when more than one student has similar preferred materials. But one thing, for example, lots of kids love superheroes. Learning to identify the sounds of words, we might pick superheroes they like and have them identify those words, and then they're motivated. They could count. Instead of counting Unifix cubes that teachers use, maybe we have blocks that have pictures of the superheroes on them and they learn to count those. We want to follow kids' leads when we can, and I think a lot of people think about this as kind of following the child around and doing stuff, and that's really not what we mean. We want to kind of follow the direction they give us and how long they can stay attending to an activity, which we can then stretch later, and in the activities that they enjoy. And what they want to do with those materials. Maybe they want to finger paint instead of use a brush or something like that. Maybe they want to write with a pencil instead of a crayon. And those are leads that we can follow. And then we talk sort of about different levels of motivation and choice that different kids may need. So if I can find an individual very favorite Thomas the Train material, a student may be really motivated to use that. And I might use that for activities they hate and I can't keep their attention on. But there may be other things we do in the classroom that the kids kind of like, but it's just that they need a little bit of a push, and maybe I can just put some stickers on a worksheet that helps them orient to it. So we need to kind of look at the activity, how hard the goal is, how motivated my student is even that day, and I can kind of balance that so I don't have to be on fire with the favorite activity during everything. Because of course we want the kids to learn to do the things eventually without their favorite activities. Taking turns and having peers take turns is really a good way to encourage social interaction, and like I said, it's especially useful for things where the kids can need to see what you're doing. So object play, writing, commenting, where modeling really helps. It also gives you more learning trials, because when I take my turn, I get to get those materials back, and then the child will have to do whatever it is I need for them to get them back. The important thing is, for a lot of kids, if I say my turn, they think that means all done. That's upsetting. So we need to make sure if we're turn taking, it really is a turn, and they eventually get that back so that they understand that. What we found in our observation of classrooms is that kids are very rarely encouraged to do things like this with their peers. Maybe 1% of their school day. And so we've really been working on that turn taking happening with other kids in the classroom. So again, the choices can be at different levels as well. So this little girl has a lot of beautiful choices. But I might be giving them choices between activities. Maybe I've got centers in the classroom, or I have a toy area and they can choose whatever toy they want. Maybe it's a really limited choices, so they can choose which particular worksheet they want to start with, or which game they want to play. And then within activity choices, they can choose which problem they want to start with on the worksheet, or whether they're using which color they're going to use, things like that. And this is, again, based on the child motivation, based on, as a teacher, what I can offer in that activity. But sometimes simple things like, what color paper do you want to do this on, make a big difference to a child and their feeling of control that they have, and it doesn't take a lot of effort for the teacher. And so figuring that out has been very helpful. So an example would be, I might go to TGI Fridays and they have a huge menu. I can get almost anything I want, and other people that are with me have lots of different choices. It's not a choice of anything in the world. There's probably not sushi on that menu, but there are a lot of different choices, and most people can find something. I might go to a really nice restaurant that has a prix-fixe menu, and I only have a couple of choices, so that's more of that limited choice category. Or maybe I'm at my grandma's and she's making tacos, and I'm having tacos because that's what's there, but I can choose what my toppings are. And that's sort of the kind of difference that in the different choice categories. So here's my friend Aiden, and he loves Legos. And he has goals for color identification, for counting, and for taking turns. So what are some ways that we can use Legos for color identification? Matching, yep.
Naming.
Yep. Yeah. So luckily Legos come in tons of colors nowadays, not like in the old days when they were only primary colors. But yeah, we can do it with all those things. And we could match them to things that aren't Legos, so he can bring in different materials. Same counting, right? So we got lots of pieces in this particular. Legos are a great thing for kids to love because you can do like anything with them. Taking turns, there could be one of those map Lego, they're buildings and they have the steps, and the kids could take turns doing the steps. They could just take turns. Who's got the bucket? You've got to ask your friend for the particular one you want, things like that. We found this online actually, where a teacher had done something a little more complicated, where she's got math problems. This is 9 plus 9 and 9 plus 4, and then the answer is on the sheet, and they have to match the math problem to the answer, and at the end they get to build whatever they want with their Legos. And you could do this with puzzle pieces or character things you make, things that lots of kids would like, so you don't have to obviously develop a new activity for every activity you do, and so that's kind of a challenge. But there are lots of creative ways to build those things in, especially for those activities that you're having trouble getting kids to do without behavior challenges. And so in groups, how do we do that in groups? So one way is to kind of personalize assignments. So a lot of teachers use worksheets for things like letters. Maybe this student likes animals, so you find A-letter animals and they write those. Maybe somebody likes Thomas. I know none of our kids like Thomas, but they can write Alfie, Annie, and Arthur, right? So figuring out things like that. That doesn't even have to change the worksheet, right? You could just have the parents send in their favorite thing and have it sitting at the desk, and when they write it, they get to play with it for a second. You can also allow students choices in materials. So I could be my paper helper, could pass it out, and kids can choose what color paper they want. They could choose the theme of the activity. They can choose the order the activities go in. Things like that. So that's sort of how we do the shared control piece. And then working with the teachers, we work with them once they've learned the components to develop lesson plans for the activities for different kids in their classroom, so we get lots of practice in how to weave these things in through the day. So now I just want to give you some preliminary outcomes of our project. We have 17 participating school districts. We taught teachers, they all joined the study in the first year, and then we randomized them to a year of training. So you can see about 30 teachers each year. If you randomize a teacher 3 years before you train her, sometimes she has a baby or moves before you get to her training year. And I say her because 90% of our teachers were female. So we had 92 participants. 90% female. Most of them had some good experience with kids. Majority of them were special education teachers, a couple of resource teachers, and a couple of inclusion classrooms. We went through our training protocol that we talked about before, and they met together, everybody in their district, so usually 4 to 8 teachers, sometimes paraprofessionals, and then every week for 2 hours. For 6 weeks, we went through these different activities. They chose an activity they wanted to work with for CPRT, and up to 2 kids in their classroom with autism that they would target. So we would work with them on goals for those kids and activities. And then once they got through the training, we did coaching in their classrooms, where first session would be doing a lesson plan, and then the coach would come observe, assess fidelity of implementation or how well they were doing the steps, provide feedback and answer questions. Teachers got an average of 7.5 sessions, paraprofessionals 5.5, mostly because of scheduling. So our goal was to do once a week until they were getting it, and then every other week, and then once a month. Sometimes the school district or the school year ended, so that ended coaching, but that's about how much they got. So if we look at use of the strategies, this is the percent of the participants that reached mastery level for the teachers and the paraprofessionals each year. And you can see that 70% of the teachers are meeting mastery, and that means they're doing all of the components at mastery level at the same time, which is a challenge. But most of them were able to do that. Paraprofessionals had a little bit more of a challenge. Many of them couldn't come to the training sessions, and so one of our next steps will be to look at how we can improve that piece. So far, the teachers have been really satisfied with the intervention. 82% think it's very or highly successful with their students, which is our main goal, obviously. And most are comfortable implementing it. Some are even comfortable training others. We're hoping that their follow-up year, they may feel a little more comfortable training others. The students that we saw, we have data on about 257 students. 83% are male, as is similar to in autism. They are an average of about 6 years of age. We enrolled kids from 3 to 10. We have one 11-year-old. And about half of them, their families identified as Hispanic. And so these are really, really, really preliminary outcomes. Like if my statistician knew I was showing these to you, I'd get in trouble. So, so they may change. But we looked at IEP goals using a method called goal attainment scaling. And what we saw was that kids in the group, the year their teacher was receiving CPRT, made greater progress on their social goals than kids in the control group. Parents and teachers filled out the pervasive developmental disorders behavior inventory, and we saw that teachers were trained in CPRT were doing better on their approach and pragmatic skills. And when we took 4 videos every year of each teacher. They also love that. When teachers are using more CPRT strategies, we're seeing higher engagement in the lesson of the children. So we also are looking over time, and we are still having some where to go next sustainment concerns. So at 18 months after training, we asked the teachers to complete a survey about whether they're still using CPRT. We can only get about half of them to complete the survey. Some of them have changed jobs. Some of them just aren't answering us. And so that's a challenge for us. But of those that answer, most of them are saying they're using CPRT and are motivated to use it. But you can see they're still using parts. So we still need to figure out what the parts are. We think that some of that is that some of the kids, especially as they get older, are doing well at a normative level with the other kids, so you don't need to sort of give them a reinforcer every time. We want to see that, but doesn't make our fidelity look good, right? So we're kind of looking at our data to see how we can capture the changes and see which changes are okay and which changes aren't. You can also see that in their next year, when we go back in, only 40% are meeting fidelity now. Now, because that's the beginning of the school year and they haven't done it in a long time, I don't know yet because we haven't done the end of the year, but that's a challenge. And that's been a challenge in previous studies as well. So what do we need to do to help people continue to get coaching within their own districts and programs so they can continue to use the strategies? And a couple of things, that maybe some things about the intervention we still need to change. There may be some things that could happen in the school. For example, the autism specialist maybe could be trained to continue with coaching. There may be systems issues. So in implementation science, we know that leadership support can really help in intervention. And in special education classrooms especially, there isn't always a clear leadership support. So when we look at our data and data from other similar projects, we find that if teachers, we have a measure of how they feel about evidence-based practice, if they have a positive feeling, they're more likely to complete the coaching and accept the feedback and make changes based on it. And their enthusiasm for doing this training is related to their fidelity. That makes sense, right? Like the kids, the more motivated they are, the better they're going to do. So what can we do to help people, not just for this, but for other evidence-based practice, feel motivated and excited to learn that? And one of the things is to look at the implementation climate or how their school and district are supporting this. Because what we know is that the more supportive a leader is, the better it will do. And we found that. So if some districts, we had a lot of support. They signed up teachers for training. They held meetings at their school. They gave us space, and they gave teachers release time. Whereas in other districts, teachers, I don't know if their leaders knew they were doing it. They must have known. But they did it after school on their own time. And if the district was supportive, the teachers had a more positive attitude toward evidence-based practice. Remember, that was related to their training. And we also measured how they felt about the climate for implementation in their district. And if they felt that it was expected and supported that they use evidence-based practices generally, they were better at using them. Right? So if your principal is supporting you using it, if your special ed director is supporting you using it, that keeps you motivated to use it. So one of our next steps after looking at child outcomes is to really understand how we can increase that district support and provider motivation to help with that. We're also, of course, going to look more at the outcomes and what child characteristics predict good outcomes and what those key ingredients are, and do people need to be at that 80% for every step level, or is there somewhere that's kind of good enough that gets you those good outcomes? Somebody asked about the discrepancies between teachers and administrators who can and can't evaluate fidelity of implementation. We know that evaluating the fidelity of implementation leads to better implementation. So we've developed some checklists for this and for other projects where we hope that the teachers are using those to sort of self-check. Ideally, there would be someone in the district who would know how to use the intervention and be able to also do some checking, because sometimes it's hard to self-check. Or you can't tell what you're not doing. Administrators may not be the person to do that because they have not just that classroom, not just that intervention, but a lot, and I'm not sure that we can expect them, at least they told me when I talked to some administrators in Connecticut last week, they cannot be expected to know every single intervention. But if they can know a little bit about it to help encourage specific steps, that's really helpful. Sometimes a mid-level sort of manager or supervisor could be a person to do that. Some districts have used some, like their autism specialists or their program specialists, and different program specialists will have expertise in different interventions, so they're kind of the go-to person for that. This person said perhaps peer coaching, and that's something we're exploring as well, having mentor teachers who can help with fidelity and developing lesson plans and things like that. How can PBRT be used to teach social skills? That is a long day long talk, and I can, if you find me afterwards, share some resources and some studies that have been done to help teach social skills using PRT. There are some other methods for teaching social skills that are not PRT that might also be well incorporated into that. Because again, this is not going to be a strategy for every single thing. What are the next steps your team would like to see districts take in order to train and implement these strategies? What a great question. One step really is for districts to support the use of evidence-based strategies in a tangible way, okay? So districts that support by providing ongoing coaching, by supporting learning communities, by making sure the materials are available to do a particular task, by recognizing teachers and other providers who are using the strategies well, that makes a difference. And so we are hoping to look at whether we can systematically train some of those implementation leadership skills, and if that makes a difference or not. We think that it will. And so we're working with a researcher named Greg Ahrens, who's doing this in mental health, by training leadership to do these kinds of things, to try to get that project going for districts. And a lot of districts are really excited about it, probably the ones that are already doing it. Were studies done in classrooms with older students 12 to 15 years, and are there differences? We have not done those studies, and some of the reasons are, it's not that you can't use these strategies with older individuals, and we actually just talked to someone on the phone yesterday who wants to think about how to do some of these motivational strategies with young adults in their day programs. We have not done that, and so the examples in our manuals, both the parent manuals and the teacher manuals, are really for kids to about 10 years old. And so it's not that I don't think they can be done, and I think that now people are really looking at what happens as you get older and what we can do. That the tasks are different, the lessons are different, and so I think the way we need to implement those strategies Motivational strategies, naturalistic behavioral strategies, of course, can be used, but the examples and the methods of implementation, I think, need to be different, and probably we need to go through some similar steps at looking at what those lessons look like, what a student's day looks like to do that. And I think that would be a great next thing to do. Looking at the time, okay. So for many older individuals with autism, missing out on early interventions and research studies, will there be a focus on research or opportunities to target this age population to get brain imaging scans to see what the comparison is to those who are younger or who received intervention? We study octogenarians to see and learn. So would we apply this same concept? So same kind of thing. You could apply a lot of these concepts, but I think we need to really think about when and how and what kinds of activities we could use, what the goals are of the program and of the lessons, and how we can integrate these strategies. There are people working on that, and I hope to move into that eventually. But there are people with more experience working with older individuals who are working on it than I have, so I'm sure they will do a much better job. I think there are some studies here at the Mind Institute in terms of brain imaging for a variety of ages, and so I'm sure at the open house they'll have information on that. Whether they are comparing adults who have had early intervention to people who haven't, I don't know the answer to that, but we can certainly look into it. Somebody asked about how I feel about using the iPad as a teaching tool. Is this method beneficial or effective? I don't know the answer to that, of whether that's been studied. We looked at using the iPad as a tool for coaching teachers, where we could video record them and kind of tag where good examples and challenges they were having, and that actually kind of sped up how their teaching was for some of the teachers, so we're trying to look at refining that. I've seen nice examples of using the iPad for communication and social skills lessons, but I don't know that literature well enough to know what the outcomes are, and likely a lot of the programs are relatively new, so we probably have to wait and see how that goes. I don't think there's, using technology in general, I think can be a great thing, and certainly that allows alternative communication methods that are a lot cheaper than what we used to have available. So I think that's an exciting area.
The UC Davis Mind Institute was created in 1998 with a promise to find cures for neurodevelopmental disorders. Every day, our physicians and researchers come closer to fulfilling that promise. Their groundbreaking research on autism, Fragile X syndrome, chromosome 22q11.2 deletion syndrome, ADHD, and other brain disorders are helping children achieve their fullest potential. Please visit our website to find out more about current studies, upcoming events, and how you can help make a difference.